I almost didn't notice it at first. The wrongness, I mean. It wasn't anything you could point to, not at the beginning. It was the kind of feeling that settles into your shoulders before your brain catches up. The way a room can go quiet a half-second before someone says something they've been holding all night. My sister had called it a celebration. Just the family. She'd said on the phone, in that bright voice she used when she wanted something. We've all been so distant since Mom passed. Let's just be together. And I'd believed her, or I'd wanted to, because grief makes you hungry for the people who are left. But when I walked into her dining room that evening, the first thing I noticed was that my chair had been moved. Not gone. Moved. Pushed down to the far end of the table, away from the head where I usually sat, with a place setting that looked just slightly too perfect. And beside my sister's plate, half hidden under her folded napkin, was a slim folder, cream-colored, closed, waiting. Let me back up and tell you who I am because you should know whose voice you're listening to. My name is Lauren. I'm 43. I've spent the last decade as a hospice nurse in a small city in the Midwest, and I am very, very good at reading a room before anyone in it has spoken a word. That last part matters more than the rest. Remember it, the people around that table were the people I'd known my whole life, and yet that night they felt like a cast I was meeting for the first time. There was my older sister, Renee, polished as always, her hair done, her smile arranged, moving around the kitchen like a hostess auditioning for something. There was her husband, Greg, the man who'd managed everyone's money for years and never let you forget it, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded over his stomach, watching me a little too warmly, like a salesman who already knows your weak spot. There was my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, 71 years old and sharp as a tack, the kind of woman who notices the price tags other people forget to remove. And then there was the empty space none of us mentioned, the chair my mother would have filled. Gone barely 4 months now, still heavy at that table like a weight none of us could lift. I clocked who was warm and who was performing. I noticed that Greg kept glancing at the folder, then at me, then away. And I noticed that Aunt Carol was watching that folder too, with a small frown she didn't bother to hide. Before I tell you what happened next, can I just ask you something? Have you ever walked into a room and known, just known, that the people you love were about to do something you'd never forgive? That quiet, sinking certainty. If you have, I'd really love to hear about it, so do me a favor and tell me in the comments below. What happened and what did you do? I read them, I promise, and stories like these have a way of finding the people who need them. And if you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who showed up when it was hard and got overlooked when it counted, then stick with me here, because this story is for you. Maybe go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one lands. Okay, back to that table. The plates went down, something braised that smelled like a holiday, and Greg picked up his wine glass and said, almost as an afterthought, you know, while we've got everyone in one place, we should get a little paperwork sorted out. Easier to do these things together. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. And Renee laughed, too quickly, a beat ahead of the joke that hadn't been made yet, and reached over to touch the edge of that cream-colored folder like she was making sure it was still there. And that was the moment the feeling in my shoulders finally reached my brain, because there was only one thing left in this family that wasn't sorted out, only one thing worth gathering everyone in one place and arranging the chairs and rehearsing the smiles for. My mother's house. The house I'd spent the last year of her life inside of. Nobody had named it in the invitation. Nobody had to. So I set my fork down gently and I smiled and I said nothing. Because here is what they didn't know. They were looking at the daughter who'd been too soft to fight for anything. The one who took care of people for a living. The one who'd never raised her voice at a holiday in her life. They'd built their whole evening around that version of me. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last year of my mother's life at her bedside, alone, when the rest of them were busy. They didn't know what she'd told me in those long, quiet hours, when the morphine made her honest and the house went still. They didn't know that making it official had meant more than words to her, that she'd insisted on it, that she'd been more clear-eyed about this family than any of us wanted to admit. And they certainly didn't know what I'd brought with me that night. Tucked into a bag I'd set down beside my own moved chair, without a single one of them noticing. I looked around that table at the people I loved, and the people I no longer trusted, and I realized they weren't going to reveal their plan all at once. So I decided I'd let them. I'd let the evening show me exactly what it was. I'd watch, and I'd wait, and when the moment came, I'd be the only person in that room who already knew how it ended. To understand why that folder on the table made my stomach turn the way it did, you have to understand the year that came before it. The year nobody in that room had lived except me. When my mother first got sick, there was a flurry of concern, the way there always is at the beginning. Phone calls, casseroles, Renee saying, "Whatever you need, just ask." But sickness is a long road, and people get tired of roads that don't end where they want them to. The casseroles stopped, the calls got shorter, and somewhere in there, without anyone deciding it out loud, it became understood that I would be the one. I was the nurse, after all. I was the one without children at home, the one whose schedule was flexible, the one who was just so good at this. So I drove the 40 minutes to her house 3, 4, 5 times a week. Then I stopped driving home and just stayed. I learned the rhythm of her medications. I bathed her when she could no longer manage it herself, and I held her hand through the indignities that strip a proud woman down to something fragile. I paid the pharmacy bills the insurance fought, and I never mentioned the amounts to anyone. And during all of it, Renee would visit for an hour on a Sunday, kneel beside the bed for a photograph, post it that evening with 3 crying emojis, and a caption about treasuring every moment, and then drive back to her life. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand the difference between the daughter who showed up in the pictures and the daughter who showed up at 3 in the morning, when our mother was frightened and couldn't breathe. It was on one of those late nights near the end that she said it to me. She was lucid in a way she hadn't been in days, the strange clarity that sometimes comes when the body is letting go, and she reached for my hand and held it tighter than I thought she could. "The house should be yours," she told me. "You're the one who stayed." I tried to wave it off the way you do, told her not to talk like that, told her we'd all figure it out together, but she shook her head and her eyes were sharp, sharper than mine. "I know this family," she said. "I know what happens when I'm gone. I won't have you fighting them over a kitchen and a roof you already earned. I didn't want the house for what it was worth. I want you to understand that. I wanted it because it was the place I'd held her, and because she was looking at me like she finally saw all of it, every hour, every silence." And then she said the thing I would think about again and again in the months to come. She said, "I'm going to make it official. Properly. So no one can twist it." And a few days later, she had me drive her to see her lawyer. After the funeral, something shifted, and I felt it before I could name it. Renee and Greg, who had drifted so far during the hard part, suddenly couldn't get close enough. There were dinners I was invited to that I'd never been invited to before. There were gentle, casual questions that didn't feel casual at all. "Have you thought about what we'll do with the estate? We should probably talk about what's fair, eventually. Mom would want everything split evenly, don't you think?" Greg started using words like assets and liquidate in the same breath as my mother's name, as if she were a portfolio and not a person we'd just buried. I noticed all of it. I always notice. But grief had made me slow to fight, and some part of me kept hoping I was wrong about them, the way you keep hoping right up until the moment you can't anymore. So I stayed gracious. I nodded. I said we'd talk when the time was right. I let them believe my silence was softness. It was not softness. It was me watching. And now here we were, the time apparently being right, the folder no longer hidden under a napkin, but sitting in the open on the table between the wineglasses, and the braised dinner nobody was really eating. Renee tapped the top of it twice with one manicured finger, the sound small and deliberate in the quiet, and she gave me the warm smile I'd been watching her rehearse all evening. "I think," she said, "we should talk about Mom's house tonight. As a family, while we're all together." There it was. The reason for the moved chair, the careful seating, the celebration that was never a celebration. The trap had a door, and she'd just opened it, and she was waiting for me to walk through it the way they'd all agreed I would. So I set down my fork a second time, slower now, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I felt something cold and steady settle over me, the same calm I get at a bedside when everything is going wrong, and someone has to be the one who doesn't panic. "All right," I said, "let's talk about it." And I let the silence stretch just long enough to watch the first flicker of surprise cross my sister's face. Greg took that as his cue. He cleared his throat, set down his wine glass with a little ceremony, and folded his hands on the table like a man about to deliver news he'd practiced in the car. I just want to say first, he began, that this isn't about money. It's never been about money. This is about family. I have learned, over a lifetime of sitting in rooms where hard things get said, that whenever a man tells you it isn't about money, it is always, entirely, about money. He talked for a while. He talked about unity, about how Mom would have hated to see us divided, about doing right by everyone and making sure nobody felt left out. He said the word fair so many times it started to lose its shape. It was a generous, sounding speech, warm and reasonable, the kind of speech designed to make refusing it feel like an act of cruelty. And underneath every soft word was a single hard instruction: give it up, and do it quietly, so we don't have to feel bad about taking it. I let him finish. I've found people tell you the most when you don't interrupt them. Then Renee slid the folder across the table toward me, and she opened it herself, smoothing the pages flat with her palm. It was an agreement. A real one, printed and formatted, with headings and clauses and lines at the bottom for signatures. The language was dressed up, but I read it slowly and the meaning was simple enough. The house would be placed into joint ownership between the two of us, then sold, with the proceeds split down the middle. There was a pen lying beside it. An actual pen, set there in advance, angled toward my side of the table like a prop in a play, where everyone but me had read the script. Across from me, Aunt Carol's frown deepened, and she shifted in her seat, but she didn't say anything yet. I didn't either. I just kept reading, slower than I needed to, because I wanted them to sit in the quiet while I did it. Renee couldn't sit in it for long. She leaned toward me, and her voice dropped into something soft and intimate, the voice she used to use when we were girls, and she wanted me to cover for her. "You've always cared about family more than money, Lauren," she said. "That's just who you are. You're not like the rest of us, you never have been." She smiled, and the smiles around the table tightened in a way that told me this part had been discussed too. They were counting on it. The whole evening was built on the belief that if they framed my generosity as my identity, I'd have no choice but to live up to it. That, if they called me the selfless one loudly enough, I'd be too proud or too kind to be anything else. It was, I'll admit, a good plan. It would have worked on a lot of people. It would have worked on the version of me they thought they were having dinner with. But I wasn't going to cry and I wasn't going to argue, because both of those were just different doors into the room they'd built for me. So instead I tilted my head and I asked, in the same mild voice I'd used to ask a patient's family who their primary physician was, "Who drafted this?" The table went still. Greg blinked. I went on, "It's a nice document, very thorough. I'm just curious who put it together, and whether they checked the current title on the property before they wrote it." For just a second, something crossed Greg's face that he couldn't quite hide, a small stumble, a hairline crack in all that confidence. He recovered fast, started to say something about a friend who does this sort of thing all the time, but I'd already seen it. I let the silence stretch again, longer this time, long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough for everyone at that table to register that the conversation had just slipped out of the lane they'd built for it. And in that quiet, I let myself finally really look, at what was wrong with the piece of paper sitting in front of me. It struck me, sitting there in that stretched-out silence, how fast the whole thing had moved. I glanced at the clock on Renee's wall almost without meaning to. 10 minutes. That was all it had been since the folder came out from under the napkin. 10 minutes from, "Let's talk about Mom's house," to a printed agreement and a pen pointed at my hand. People don't move that fast unless they've rehearsed. And the more I let myself notice, the more the small things lined up into something I couldn't unsee. The pen placed in advance. The chair moved before I arrived. The speech that flowed too smoothly to be spontaneous. A legal-looking document with no lawyer in the room to explain it, on a night billed as a family celebration. None of it was an accident. All of it was choreography. And the strange thing about realizing you're inside someone else's choreography is that it stops being frightening and starts being almost clarifying, because once you see the steps, you can see where the dancer is about to stumble. And then I saw it. The thing that gave the whole evening away. I let my eyes move back down to the first page of their agreement, to the paragraph that described the property and named its owner. And there it was in plain, confident type. The document listed our mother as the current sole owner of the house, the person whose property was to be split between her daughters. And I knew, with a certainty that sat in my chest like a stone going still, that this was no longer true. It hadn't been true for months. They had built this entire ambush, the dinner and the speech and the pen, on a fact that had quietly stopped being a fact while they weren't paying attention. While they were posting photographs and asking about assets, the ground had shifted under them and they never felt it. My face didn't change. I want you to understand that. I've spent years keeping my face still while my mind raced, telling families their person was slipping away without letting my own voice break. So I sat there, calm as still water, and let them believe they were winning, while inside I was already 3 moves ahead of every person at that table. That was when I felt eyes on me, and I looked up to find Aunt Carol watching me from across the table. She'd been quiet the whole time, but she was nobody's fool, and I think she'd smelled the same thing in the air that I had the moment I walked in. Our eyes met, and something passed between us, wordless and complete. She gave me the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. And in that nod I understood something that changed everything. I wasn't alone in that room. They had gathered witnesses, you see. They'd invited Aunt Carol and seated everyone just so. Because a thing done in front of family feels harder to undo, feels settled, feels real. They wanted an audience to make their version of events the official one. What they hadn't considered was that an audience can witness more than one truth. The very people meant to pressure me into signing could just as easily watch me not sign, and watch why. So I folded my hands on the table, and I let a small, gracious smile come to my face, and I spoke for the first time in what felt like a long while. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it to sound warm, because warmth unsettles people who are braced for a fight. Really. Thank you all for thinking about the family, and about Mom, and about doing this together. Renee's shoulders eased just slightly, the way they do when someone thinks they've gotten what they wanted. And then I added, in the same easy tone, "Before anyone signs anything tonight though, there's something I think everyone here should see." The shift in the room was instant and physical. Greg's hand, which had been drifting toward the pen as if to be helpful, went still. The little knot of confidence around the table loosened into something more careful. Renee's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes started moving. They had spent 10 minutes building a moment they were sure they controlled, and in a single sentence I had taken hold of it, and not one of them yet knew exactly how. I reached down for the bag beside my moved chair, the one not a single one of them had noticed when I walked in, and I set it on my lap. I want to tell you something about instinct, because this is the part where it earned its keep. When Renee called me about that dinner, when she used that bright voice and said, "Just the family," some quiet part of me didn't believe her. I couldn't have told you why. There was nothing I could point to. But I've learned over the years to trust the feeling that arrives before the evidence does, the one that taps you on the shoulder and says pay attention. So that afternoon, before I drove over, I did something I almost talked myself out of. I gathered everything. Every document related to my mother's affairs that had passed through my hands during that long year, the things I'd kept careful copies of out of habit more than suspicion, and I put them in a folder of my own, and I put that folder in the bag I now lifted onto my lap. I'd felt a little foolish doing it. I felt much less foolish now. I looked around the table and I said, half to them and half to myself, I kept copies of everything. From the start. Not because I didn't trust anyone. Just because somebody had to keep track, and that somebody was always me. Then I opened my folder, and I laid the first page flat on the table, where the pen still waited, and I turned it to face them. It was the deed. The official, recorded, stamped deed to my mother's house, showing in plain language that the property had been legally transferred into my name while she was still alive. Properly witnessed. Properly filed with the county. Done with the help of the same lawyer she'd insisted on seeing, on the day she'd told me she wanted to make it official so no one could twist it. I watched Renee read it. I watched the moment the words stopped being words and became their meaning. Watched the color move out of her face. Greg leaned in, scanning fast, his lips moving slightly, and then he went very, very quiet. The particular silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. The house they had gathered everyone to split was not our mother's to split. It hadn't been for months. It was mine, And it had been mine the whole time they were rehearsing their speeches. I didn't stop there. Because I knew exactly what came next in a family like ours. The accusation that always follows when the quiet daughter turns out to hold the cards. So before anyone could say it, I laid down the second page. It was a letter, handwritten, in my mother's own hand, dated and clear, addressed to both of her daughters by name. In it she explained, in her own words, what she had decided and why. That the house was going to me. That it was her choice, made with a clear mind. That she wanted us to understand it was a thank you and not a wound, and that she hoped we'd find peace with it. It took away, before it could even be spoken, the lie that I had manipulated a dying woman into signing something she didn't understand. There it was in her own handwriting, the loops and slants none of us could mistake. Aunt Carol reached over, slid it toward herself, and read it slowly. Then she looked up and said, in a voice that carried, "That's Margaret's hand. I'd know it anywhere. That's exactly how she wrote." And just like that, the one weapon they had left was gone. But there was one more thing, and I told them about it gently, because it was the heaviest of the three. I reached into my bag and set my phone on the table, face up, screen glowing, and I said, "I should tell you. This has been recording since the folder came out. I want to be clear with you about why. I didn't do it to trap anyone. I did it because the moment I sat down at that table I felt the shape of an ambush, and a woman who has felt that shape learns to protect herself." Every word of Greg's speech about fairness was on it. Renee's soft voice telling me who I was. The pressure, the pen, all of it. The room understood at once what that meant. The witnesses they had so carefully gathered to make their version official were now witnesses to mine, and worse, every persuasive, generous, sounding thing they'd said to push me into signing was no longer just memory. It was evidence, captured in their own voices, sitting on the table between us with the little red timer still counting up. For a long moment nobody breathed, and then Greg pushed his chair back from the table, and the mask I'd been watching all night finally began to come apart. The warmth went out of Greg all at once, like a light switched off. The folded hands, the patient salesman's smile. This isn't about money. Calm. All of it dropped away and left something harder underneath. "So that's it, then," he said, and his voice had an edge now that he didn't bother to sand down. "You went behind everyone's back and you took the whole thing for yourself. You stole it. Stole." The word hung there over the braised dinner nobody had touched. And here is the thing about a man losing his footing, he says more than he means to. Because Greg kept going, and in his anger the real shape of things came tumbling out. He talked about what they'd been counting on. He mentioned, almost without realizing it, the timeline they'd had in mind for selling, the buyer he'd already been feeling out, the money that was supposed to land before certain other things came due. Debts. He didn't use the word, but I'd sat across from enough people in crisis to hear it underneath the rest. This had never been about fairness or about Mom. It was about a hole in their finances they'd planned to fill with my mother's house, and with my silence. He said it all in front of everyone, and the saying of it did more damage than any accusation I could have made. Renee saw the room turning and she changed tactics, the way she always could, faster than weather. The hard line left her face and her eyes filled, right on cue, and her voice climbed into something small and wounded. "I just wanted to feel included," she said, and a tear actually fell. "You were always Mom's favorite, always. The good one, the one who stayed, and I'm sitting here looking like the villain when all I ever wanted was to not be left out of my own mother's life. It was a good performance. I'll give her that. A year ago it might even have worked. Because there's a part of an older sister you never quite stop wanting to comfort. But I'd held our mother's hand at 3 in the morning while Renee slept soundly 40 minutes away, and I knew the difference now between someone who was hurting and someone who had simply been caught. So I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said quietly, "You can cry, Renee. I understand why you would. But I'm not going to sit here and be turned into the person who hurt you, when we both know what this dinner was supposed to be." And I let that sit, because gentleness can be a wall too if you mean it. The strangest thing happened then. The witnesses they had so carefully arranged began to do exactly what witnesses do, which is see. Aunt Carol set the letter down and folded her hands and said, in that steady, unhurried voice of hers, "I sat with your mother more than either of you knows. And I can tell you that everything in this letter is exactly what she told me she wanted." Exactly. She looked around the table, at the pen, at the folder, at the two faces across from me. "I don't know what you thought was going to happen here tonight," she said, "but this is not it." And one by one I watched the air in the room change owners. The relatives who had been gathered to make Renee and Greg's version official were now sitting in the truth of mine, and there was nothing performed about the discomfort on their faces. The social weight of that table, the thing they had counted on to press me into signing, had quietly, completely shifted to my side. I hadn't raised my voice once. So I reached out and I slid their agreement back across the table, past the wine glasses, until it sat in front of Renee where it had started. The pen rolled a little and stopped. "Nothing's getting signed tonight," I said. "Not tonight and not ever. There's nothing here to sign." The pen lay there between us, the prop they'd set out so confidently an hour before, and now it just looked like what it was, a small useless thing at the center of a plan that had collapsed under its own weight. Greg wouldn't look at me. Renee was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, but the tears had stopped being useful and she knew it. And I sat there with my mother's handwriting on the table, and her house in my name, and a calm in my chest I hadn't felt in months. Watching the evening they'd built to break me finish breaking instead in their own hands. Greg made one last grab at the only thing he had left, which was noise. "This isn't over," he said, pushing his chair back and standing, as if height would help him. "We'll get our own lawyer. We'll contest the whole thing. A deed like that, signed by a sick woman, family pressure, undue influence. There are people who do nothing but unwind exactly this kind of arrangement." He was trying to sound certain, but I've watched a lot of people try to sound certain about things they're afraid of, and it has a particular pitch to it. So I let him finish, and then I said, without any heat at all, "You're welcome to talk to a lawyer, Greg. I'd encourage it. Honestly." I tapped the deed where it lay on the table. "But before you spend the money, you should know what they'll tell you." This deed was recorded properly, months ago, with her own attorney present. There's a dated letter in her own handwriting explaining her reasons, which Aunt Carol just confirmed in front of everyone. And there's a recording of the four of you, tonight, trying to pressure me into signing it all away over dinner. I let that line land softly. If anyone in this room used pressure to get a signature on a house, it wasn't me. So please, talk to your lawyer. I think they'll tell you to sit down. And he sat down. But I didn't want to win the night and lose everything else, and I'd had months to think about what I actually wanted, so I told them. "Here's how this is going to go," I said, and my voice was even, the voice I use when a family needs a plan more than they need their feelings managed. "The house is mine. That part isn't a conversation. What I'm asking for is simple. No one raises the subject of that house with me again, ever. Greg, you owe Aunt Carol an apology, because you used her. You invited her here to be a prop and she deserved better than that. And the rest of the family hears the truth, all of it, from me. Not some version of it that makes me the thief." Then I did the thing I think surprised them most. "Mom's personal things," I said. "Or jewelry, the photographs, the furniture that meant something. We split all of that, honestly and together, and Renee, you get first choice of whatever you want to remember her by." Because I was never the one who wanted everything. I just wouldn't be robbed of the one thing she'd given me on purpose. Then I turned to my sister, because the house and the lawyers were the easy part, and she was not. "Renee," I said, and I waited until she looked at me. "I'm not closing the door on you. I want you to hear that, but I'm not going to pretend tonight didn't happen either, and I'm not going to chase you. If you want something real with me, it's going to start with you being honest, with me and with yourself, about what you tried to do at this table. That's the price. Not money. Just the truth." She opened her mouth and then closed it again, and for once nothing came out, no tears, no performance, just a woman sitting very still with the wreckage of her own plan in front of her. I didn't need an answer right then. Some repairs can't be rushed, and trying to force one would only have given her something else to perform. So I let the silence be hers to fill whenever she was ready, or never. And then I gathered my folder, my mother's letter, the deed, the phone that had quietly done its work, and I put them back in my bag. I stood, and I walked around the table to where Aunt Carol sat, and I bent down and kissed the top of her head, and she squeezed my hand hard enough to tell me everything she couldn't say with the others listening. Then I picked up my coat. No one tried to stop me. No one quite knew what to say to the daughter who was supposed to leave that house with nothing, and was instead leaving it with everything that mattered, including her dignity. The dinner that had been built to strip me down had, in the end, only shown everyone at that table exactly who I'd been all along, and exactly who they were. I said a quiet goodnight, and I let myself out into the cold, and I stood on the steps for a moment just breathing, the porch light warm behind me and the whole rigged evening already turning into something I'd survived rather than something happening to me. The phone call came 3 days later, and it was Aunt Carol. I almost didn't pick up, because I was bracing for more, the way you do after a night like that, expecting every ring to be another round. But her voice was gentle, and the first thing she said was, "I owe you something, Lauren." She told me she'd been turning it over since the dinner, and that what bothered her most wasn't Greg's nerve or Renee's tears. It was that she'd very nearly been used as furniture in their plan, and hadn't seen it coming until she was already sitting at the table. "I should have known the second they sat me where they did," she said. "Your mother saw through those 2 years ago. I should have trusted her, and I should have trusted you." Then she told me she'd be backing me with the rest of the family, plainly and out loud, and that anyone who had questions could call her directly. I sat down on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear and felt something I hadn't let myself feel in months, which was the simple, enormous relief of being believed by someone whose belief actually cost them something. The truth has a way of traveling once it's let out of the room, and over the next couple of weeks it did. I didn't have to push it. The recording existed, my mother's letter existed, the deed existed, and Aunt Carol was telling anyone who asked exactly what she'd witnessed. The family's picture of things began to rearrange itself. Cousins who'd half believed I'd grabbed the house quietly started calling to say they understood now, that they were sorry they'd ever wondered. And the harder edge of it landed on Greg, because once people started really looking, the debts he'd been so careful to keep behind that confident smile didn't stay hidden either. The man who managed everyone's money turned out to have been less in control of his own than anyone knew, and a plan that had counted on my silence to stay buried instead dug itself up in front of everybody. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that. I never said a word against him to a single relative. I didn't have to. The truth did all the work I would have been tempted to do myself, and it did it cleaner than I ever could have. There was a night, not long after, when I went to the house alone, my house, though it still felt strange to say it. I let myself in and stood in the quiet of it, and I walked through the rooms in the dark, and I thought about what the place had actually meant in all of this. It was never the money. I could have sold it the next morning, and the ache wouldn't have been touched. What that house held was the year I'd spent inside it, the chair by her bed, the kitchen where I'd warmed broth at 2 a.m, the hallway I'd walked 1,000 times listening for her breathing. It was the place she'd looked at me and finally said she saw me. And standing there, I understood that the dinner had never really been about a building at all. It had been about whether I was a person they had to reckon with, or a soft thing they could move out of the way. And the house was just where that question got answered. I decided then that I wasn't going to sell it. I was going to live in it and let it be what it had been to her, a home kept by the one who stayed. The message from Renee came late one evening, and I almost missed it. It was short. No long defense, no fresh tears in text form, none of the polished language I'd braced for. Just a few lines that said she knew what she'd done, that she didn't expect me to answer, and that she was sorry, the words sitting there plain and small with nothing decorating it. It wasn't a full apology. It didn't undo anything, and it didn't ask me to. But it was the first thing she'd said to me in years that didn't feel arranged in advance. The first time I'd heard something that sounded like my actual sister instead of the version of her that always wanted something. I read it twice. I didn't reply right away, because I'd meant what I said at the table about repair taking time and not being chased. But I didn't delete it either. I left it sitting in my phone. The door I'd told her I wouldn't close still open, just the width of those few honest lines, and I let myself believe, carefully, that it might one day be the start of something true. I'll be honest with you about something, because I think you've earned honesty by staying with me this long. There was a stretch of nights after that dinner when I thought about punishment. Real punishment. I had a recording of grown adults pressuring me to sign away property, with a witness. In their own voices. I'd talked to enough people in my life to know that what they'd attempted had names, ugly legal ones, and that I could have made the rest of their year very difficult if I'd wanted to. I could have cut every one of them off completely, changed my number, erased them, and let them explain my absence to whoever asked. And on the worst of those nights, lying awake with the whole scene replaying, I wanted to. I wanted them to feel even a fraction of what it felt like to be the daughter who showed up and got treated like an obstacle. I'm not going to pretend I floated above all that. I sat right in it for a while. The wanting to hurt them back was real, and I think anyone who tells you they wouldn't feel it is lying. But I kept coming back to a question I couldn't get around, which was, who do I want to be when this is over? Because the dinner would end whether I burned everything down or not. The deed was mine either way. My mother's wishes were honored either way. The only thing still genuinely up to me was what kind of person walked out the other side of it. And I knew, the way you know a thing in your body before you can argue with it, that if I spent my one life torching the people who'd wronged me, I'd be letting them set the shape of me even after they'd lost. My mother hadn't given me that house so I could turn it into a fortress to launch attacks from. She'd given it to me because I was the one who chose tenderness when it was hard. I didn't want to lose that woman just to win against people who already had nothing left to take. So I drew a line instead of a sword. That's the distinction I finally landed on, and it's the one I'd offer you if you ever find yourself where I was. Greg would never again have a hand in anything to do with this family's affairs, mine least of all. That door was bolted, and it would stay bolted. The boundaries were firm, and they were permanent. But I wasn't going to pursue him into the ground for the satisfaction of it. I wasn't going to spend my peace, the thing I'd fought hardest to keep, buying a punishment that wouldn't give it back to me. Protecting myself and destroying them turned out to be two different projects, and only one of them was actually mine to want. I chose the wall over the weapon. It's not as loud as revenge. It doesn't feel as good for the first 10 minutes. But it's the only version that let me sleep. And then, one evening, I did the thing I'd been putting off because I knew it would undo me. I set the table in the house for one. I made the dish my mother used to make badly, the way she always laughed at me for. And I put her photograph at the head of the table where her chair was. And I ate dinner with her one last time in the place where I'd lost her. I told her it was done. I told her I'd kept the promise, that no one had twisted it the way she'd feared, that I'd stood at that table and held the line, and walked out whole. And somewhere in the middle of it, the grief and the justice that had been at war in me for months finally lay down beside each other and went quiet. I cried, the good kind, the kind that empties you out and leaves room. And for the first time since she'd died, I wasn't crying because I'd lost her. I was crying because I'd honored her, and because she would have known, watching all of it, that the daughter who stayed had stayed all the way to the end. I know now what I didn't know walking into that dining room. I know to trust the feeling that something is off, the one that arrives before the proof, because it is almost never wrong, it is just early. I know that warm words can be the most expensive thing in the room, and that the people who tell you it isn't about money usually mean it is only about money. I know to keep my own copies, to sit at my own bedsides, to value the work no one photographs. None of that is bitterness. I don't carry it like a grudge. I carry it like a key, hard one, the kind you only get by walking through the locked door yourself. And I'd hand it to you right now if I could. So that's the truth that came out at my family dinner. I walked into that room knowing only that something was off. A moved chair, a folder under a napkin, smiles that didn't quite fit. And 10 minutes later the whole thing showed itself for what it was. They'd built an evening to erase me, and instead it revealed me, and them, and her. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: when that quiet voice tells you something isn't right, don't talk yourself out of it. Listen. Keep your proof. Keep your dignity, and know your own worth before anyone tries to talk you out of it at a dinner table. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my chair, and take care of yourself out there.